Dear friends, thank you for 900 subscriptions, you are fantastic. In the times of the Upper Permian, the balance of power in the animal kingdom was clearly regulated. On land, the therapsids were the dominators, while only a few pelycosaurs survived during this period. About 259 million years ago, the previously successful group of the dinocephalians largely died out. The ecological niche was quickly filled by new groups, especially the anomodonts. The top predators of this time were the gorgonopsians, which were gradually joined by the somewhat smaller therocephalians and cynodonts. The only competition between the dicynodonts was the parasaurs, a group of large herbivorous parareptiles. The waters in the surrounding area were hunting grounds for various amphibians, with the temnospondyls which often reached enormous sizes. Interestingly, many of these giant predators resembled the later crocodiles. They also began to expand their hunting grounds to the seas. The air was the territory of a small group of diapsids, the Wigeltisauridae. Other diapsids began an aquatic way of life. Two important groups emerged from the diapsids in the late Permian, the Lepidosauria and the Archosaurs. However, during the last 10 million years of the Permian they only represented a small marginal group. They competed with the temnospondyls. The flora changed significantly during the Upper Permian, the limpets like the Sigillaria disappeared, conifers and the new ginkgo plants spread. One speaks of a transition from the Paleophytic to the Mesophytic, which took place a time before the beginning of the Mesozoic. 4 different biomes are known in the late Permian, above all the famous Glossopteris forests in the cool regions of Gondwana. In addition to the eponymous Glossopteris, ferns and horsetail are also found in various sizes and shapes. The tropical biome consisted mainly of conifers and has been found mainly in West Africa. The Euro-American flora is also conifer-heavy, supplemented by ferns and peltispermales, as well as the first forms of the ginkgo family. The Catoazea biome, which occurred on the peninsula including China, was also dominated by conifers, supplemented by ferns, seed ferns, and horsetail plants. The fauna differed a little less, but it seems that, especially towards the end of the Permian, the Gondwana area was preferred for therapsids and diapsids. A well-ordered world with clear assignments of functions. Hardly anyone could counter the triumphant advance of the therapsids, just as the dominance of the temnospondyls in the aquatic area was undisputed. One can now speculate how everything would have developed if the Permian mass extinction had never occurred. Probably the therapsids would have occupied the areas that the dinosaurs claimed for themselves. And because they are not necessary, they would hardly have developed a higher level of intelligence. It is possible that mammals would have evolved from cynodonts in this environment, and it is likely that flying mammals would take over the function of birds today. But as is well known, things turned out differently. While everything went on in an orderly manner above the earth, it was restless in the deeper layers. Ultimately, massive flood basalt masses broke through the surface in what is now Siberia. The eruption lasted tens to hundreds of thousands of years, with a maximum 251.9 million years ago. The prolonged volcanic activity filled the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and acid-forming gases. The catastrophe had a particularly devastating effect on marine life. 90% of the species disappeared, including the last trilobite. But about 70% of the terrestrial species also disappeared completely, especially the impressive gorgonopsians, the parasaurs, and the lepispondyls. The flora suffered on this catastrophe too. The great forests were history soon. But even the surviving species did not make it without a significant toll in blood. The surviving therapsids also came to the brink of annihilation, and it would be likely that we would not exist at all if the event had lasted any longer. The amphibious creatures such as temnospondyls and the relatively new group of archosaurs were somewhat less affected. Most of the species that survived the mass extinction are found in Gondwana, far from the Siberian traps. It is astonishing that a number of survivors could also be found in Euro-America. But now they lived in another world, a world without forests, a world full of ecological niches. The amphibians fully blossomed in the first phase of the Triassic, but primarily the temnospondyls. The reptiliomorphs now also adopted the concept of the crocodile and thus competed with both temnospondylus and archosaurs. Accordingly, their success remained rather modest. It is worth noting a special newcomer who lived in Madagascar at the time, Triatobatrachus, the first known representative of modern amphibians and, of course, the first frog. The once dominant group of therapsids found themselves in a more defensive position. 3 groups had survived the mass extinction: the anomodonts, the therocephalians, and the cynodonts. The extent to which they were already hairy is left to the imagination. Another ancient group also survived, the parareptiles. Although the large parasaurs have become extinct, a group of smaller relatives, the Procolophenoidea, thrived in the lower and middle Triassic. However, they only played a minor role in the struggle for dominance in the animal kingdom. The great ascent in the first 5 million years of the Triassic was achieved by another group, the Archosaurs. They doubled their biodiversity during this time, which meant a phase of stagnation for all other animals. Not only that, after the Permian mass extinction a few 100,000 years later, 251.4 million years ago, the next crisis came. Many species became extinct, but they could mostly be compensated for by new species. But all in all, the first 5 million years of the Triassic were probably a small renaissance of the amphibians. An interesting idea was the notion that only amphibians would have survived in the Triassic. The Amphiterra project reconstructed a possible development, starting from Triatobatrachus, to beings in all possible ecological niches and roles. It is undoubtedly fantasy, but it comes across as very personable. Well, to the regret of all amphibian lovers, the fun ended at least 247 million years ago. There was massive death of the temnospondyls and of the parareptiles too. 2 groups were now preparing to take over the scepter, the Archosauromorpha and the therapsids, who were determined to do everything again. In this epoch the first archosaurs of the Avametatarsalia type appeared, from which the pterosaurs and dinosaurs later emerged. However, they were still a marginal phenomenon within the archosaurs. And although the therapsids had the larger increase, the archosaurs won thanks to their starting advantage. They managed both to defend the amphibious territory and to conquer the mainland. For better or worse, the therapsids had to be content with second place, which they also had to share with the old temnospondyls. The flora also only recovered slowly. At first it was above all frugal plants like the ferns that determined the flora. It took around 5 million years for the tree-forming plant groups to fully recover from the disaster. In addition to the conifers and ginkgo plants, the Glossopteris also survived as archaic relics from the Permian. This is probably what fascinates many of us about the Triassic, this meeting of old and new forms. There were families of both plants and animals that reached back to the times of the Carboniferous. Others, such as lepidosaurs, archosaurs, lis amphibians, and ginkgo plants were newcomers to the field. Who would win, the new or the old? It is important to mention that both lepidosaurs and archosaurs also produced marine forms, which I will not go into further here. They became the rulers of the seas in the Mesozoic, just as the dinosaurs dominated the land. But how did the dinosaurs come about? The difference between traditional archosaurs and the Avametatarsalia is to be found in the ankle. The Avametatarsalia have a hinge-like joint that primarily supports the upright posture and two-legged gait. The oldest representatives of this group were found in Tanzania. However, it already shows that they have had a lot of evolution behind them. The Acylosaurus already belongs to the closest sidelines of the dinosaurs, the Coelosauridae. The archosaurs, for their part, boasted powerful predators like the 5-meter-long Erythrosuchus. Other famous representatives of this era are the Euparchia, which was previously traded as a direct dinosaur ancestor, and the Titanosuchus, which is often equated with the mystical Cheirotherium. The Arizonosaurus, armed with a back sail, cavorted in America today. Representatives of the therapsids, such as the anomodont Canamyra, a 3-meter-long herbivore, were also of considerable size. Cynognathus, a representative of the cynodonts, was an agile predator who reached a length of 1.5 meters. About 242 million years ago, however, the species became fewer again, and this in practically all groups with exception of the Avametatarsalia. Nevertheless, they only managed to take fourth place. The Procolophenoidea, which almost became extinct, fared particularly badly at this time. The therapsids also lost a lot and fell behind the temnospondyls in third place. After the therocephalians died out, only cynodonts and anomodonts remained. Despite massive losses, the archosaurs managed sovereignly to keep their leadership position. Until 236 million years ago the population remained in a kind of stagnation, only the therapsids and archosaurs were able to recover. The temnospondyls manifested Mastodonsaurus, a 6-meter-long crocodile-like giant, 242 million years ago. Triasaurus, the first salamander, lived in Kyrgyzstan at that time. Bystroela and Matygerpatone, on the other hand, were among the last reptiliomorphs. The first attempts by the archosaurs to gain control of the skies also fell during this period. Since the extinction of the diapsid Weigeltissauridae there has been a gap. In the form of Chaeravipteryx, the archosaurs produced a family that was capable of gliding. The sliding membrane was attached between the legs and the tail. But not only the airspace, also the coast and the sea were claimed by new species such as Tanystropheus. This strange lizard was 6 meters long, with 3 meters on the neck alone. During this time, many Avametatarsalia lived in South America. There were a couple of dinosaur precursors here, such as Silesauridae, Lagosuchus, and Marasaurus. These rather small creatures were the harbinger of a development that was to change everything. A particularly interesting representative of the Lepidosaurs was Longisquama, which was native to the same region as Chaeravopteryx and whose long back scales could possibly also be used for gliding flights. There was a broad recovery in the species population 236 million years ago. The archosaurs and the Avametatarsalia could particularly benefit from this. The parareptile Procolophenoidea were given another chance. There was also a small increase in the therapsids. Mammaliiformes were added as a new group. They now shared third place with the temnospondyls, whose situation, unlike the others, stagnated. As before, the archosaurs led the way. The first real dinosaurs appeared in South America 235 million years ago. One of the oldest groups are the Herrerasauridae, small bipedal predatory dinosaurs. Pisanosaurus is the oldest known representative of the later Ornithischians. The first ancestors of the later sauropods and the first theropods were also present. In contrast to the later giants, they were all rather small animals between 1 and 2 meters in size. At the same time, the tiny Scleromochlus lived in northern Europe and is considered by many to be an ancestor of the pterosaurs. But the real rulers were the Pseudosaucian archosaurs, who are more closely related to the crocodiles. The Pseudosaucian are the sister group of the Avametatarsalia and they include the modern crocodiles. The Edosaurs or eagle lizards were an important group of herbivores and, even they weren't really big, looked quite massive next to the dinosaurs. But the 7-meter-long Saurosuchus, who shared the habitat of the dinosaurs and, if he did it skillfully, also used them as a meal, was probably even more threatening for them. The ancestors of the pterosaurs, on the other hand, suffered from the rule of Ornithosuchus, who was just over 2 meters long and was previously even interpreted as the ancestor of the great theropods. But there were also a few archosaurs from older groups, such as the astonishingly slim and agile Protocampsiaradinosuchus, who was the size of a medium-sized dog and looked like a strange hybridization of dog and crocodile. The therapsids were on the one hand still represented by the herbivorous Dicynodonts, on the other hand more progressive groups such as the Probainognathia and the even more mammal-like Mammaliiformes emerged. Even if the dinosaurs were not big at that time, the therapsids were tiny and reached maximally the size of rats. The conditions within the fauna were stable until 221 million years ago, but there were also interesting developments. For example, Carneodactylus, the first airworthy pterosaur, was found in Italy 228 million years ago. In contrast to the earlier attempts at flight by reptiles, the pterosaurs were the first actively flying vertebrates. Together with the dinosaur relatives, the pterosaurs are classified in the Ornithodira group. They are not flying dinosaurs, but they are close relatives. 221 million years ago the Triassic fauna fully recovered from the Permian mass extinction. The biodiversity increased, especially among the Pseudosocian and Avametatarsalia. A slight recovery also benefited the temnospondyls, while the therapsids were the big losers at that time. On the other hand, the lepidosaurs, especially the early relatives of the modern tuatara, flourished. The dinosaurs got bigger. Sauropods could now reach lengths of up to 8 meters, while the largest theropods were up to 5 meters long. Only the ornithischians lagged with the development. Despite this budding gigantism, they were still far from ruling the world. This was reserved for the Pseudosocian. The Edosaurs produced large herbivores such as the spiked Desmatosuchus and Stegonolepi. The Postosuchus, who belonged to the Rauersuchia, was a 5-meter-long hunter whose hunting ground was the mainland. The phytosaurs that live and look like crocodiles became even more powerful. Smilosuchus could easily be 7 meters long. Despite their way of life and appearance, they are not ancestors of the modern crocodiles. The older groups of Archosauromorpha were also prominently represented. So Chihoniosaurus and his relatives tried to glide. In the long term, however, they had no chance against the emerging dominance of the pterosaurs. The Charavipterygians are also dying out. With Hyperodapton there is also a later representative of the rhynchosaurs. The Alocadosaur Trilophosaurus was a 3-meter-sized herbivore. Placerius was the last known dicynodont. This herbivore was over 2 meters long and was popular prey for predatory archosaurs. Insects, on the other hand, were the preferred prey of Atylobasileus, a tiny Mammalia forms living in the same region. Often Atylobasileus was also traded as an early mammal. Basically, the fauna remained quite stable for the next 15 million years. The sauropods increased slightly in size during this period. At some point during this period the mammals evolved. The anomodonts finally died out 216 million years ago, so the cynodonts and their offshoots remain as the only representatives of the therapsids. The Gymnophiona, the third surviving family of amphibians, appeared 215 million years ago. 206 million years ago, 5 million years before the Triassic mass extinction, there was a drastic decline in species, especially among the Pseudosocian. This went so far that they were ultimately level with the Avametatarsalia. A large part of the older Archosauromorpha died out or experienced an enormous bloodletting. The first mammals are tangible for this time, among them Haramiyavia. However, these are not the ancestors of today's mammals, but various representatives of the subgroup Alatheria, to which the multituberculates also belong. Neither the therapsids nor the lepidosaurs are particularly affected by the upheavals, but there was an enormous decline in the temnospondyls, so that the three groups were practically on a par. Really exciting starting conditions for what will happen 5 million years later. At the end of the Rhaetian there was another large mass extinction, which was probably caused by the newly emerging Atlantic and the associated volcanism. Only the Avametatarsalia, and of these only the dinosaurs and pterosaurs, as well as the Pseudosocian, here only the crocodilomorphs, survived this event among the Archosauromorpha. The only exception were the phytosaurs, which were granted a grace period of around 5 million years. The Triassic mass extinction also radically ended the old lines of basal saurosids and parareptiles. The temnospondyls were pushed to the brink of extinction, but despite this bottleneck they were able to hold out into the Cretaceous period. The winners of the mass extinction were clearly the Avametatarsalia, especially the dinosaurs. The control of the air went to the pterosaurs. The waters, on the other hand, became a hunting ground for crocodiles. The early mammals had to wait another 135 million years before the opportunity arose to fight for world domination again. But at that time the dinosaurs ruled, and they still rule the skies today. Thanks for watching and stay froggy.